Good morning. My name is Haley Finnerty, and I will be the moderator for today's episode of EYEJ Speaks. Thank you to all who joined us last week for the conversation on exploring violence. This week, we will be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion. For those who are unfamiliar with the work of Empowering Youth Exploring Justice and/or EYEJ Speaks, let me provide you with a brief overview. EYEJ serves over 1,500 youth annually, with the mission of empowering and amplifying the voices of teens and preteens by bridging them with diverse individuals to engage in interactive discussions centered around social justice. We do so through programs including Youth Online Discussing Justice, or YODJ, a 12-week program for 6th to 12th graders that was created as a response to the pandemic to ensure youth had a virtual platform to exchange ideas and gain perspective on social justice issues with diverse and empowered community members, peers, and volunteers. We also do so through our Youth Council. The EYEJ Youth Council is a group of impressive youth ages 15 to 25 from all across districts in Cleveland, who together are brainstorming issues and addressing challenges both they and their peers face in their community. EYEJ Speaks is an interactive community discussion that features engaging conversations on social justice issues and civil rights. The topics you see here today are derived from EYEJ's youth program, YODJ. Follow EYEJ on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram to learn more about all the programming and events coming up over the next few weeks. For today's program, be sure to ask questions, make comments, and use the hashtags #EYEJSpeaks and #socialjustice in the comments section. Tomorrow, July 24th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the EYEJ Youth Council members will be hosting a 24-hour Day of Giving campaign where we are hoping to raise $20,000 in support of the Youth Council's work, such as broadband access for all in Cleveland. Additionally, we will help council members and their families challenged during this pandemic. You can also hear from Youth Council members tomorrow from 12 to 2 p.m. We will also host a donor appreciation bingo game and have some other surprises throughout the day, so be sure to visit our social media pages for more info on our Day of Giving. We cannot do this work without your help. Most recently, your contributions have enabled EYEJ to deploy 2 new online youth programs, ensuring the technological infrastructure needed is in place to deliver learning services while youth remain sheltered in place, and helped EYEJ Youth Council members and their families to cover household costs for bills, healthcare, food, and more. Thank you again for your support, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Now on to today's discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. EYEJ is making a statement that justice is not being served equally to our youth and adult communities. With the recent tragic deaths of Black men and women leading to protests and civil unrest nationwide, many individuals and organizations alike are having broader discussions about equity in America. With young people leading the charge for change, what's next in the conversation of social justice? How can we as a country have meaningful and action-oriented discourse on diversity, equity, and inclusion? This upcoming EYEJ Speaks episode will cover this topic, exploring strategies for creating a more equitable society and the role of young people in that movement. I am honored to introduce you to an incredible panel of speakers that we have today. First, we have Mai Moore, founder and executive director of EYEJ. Erica Merritt, founder and principal consultant at Equus Group. Erica DeVal, graduate student at Fuller Theological Seminary, and Yumi Nglovu, rising junior at Hathaway Brown. Thank you all for being here today. I look forward to our discussion. My first question is for all panelists. Racial inequities in Cleveland are problematic, not only for the communities they impact, but speak to a more significant national problem. For example, while 30% of the population in Cuyahoga County are Black, they make up 70% of the prison population. Amid a pandemic, we see the impact of segregation on health outcomes for Blacks. Residents who live in highly segregated Black neighborhoods are more likely to have asthma, high blood pressure, diabetes, and several other chronic health conditions. These are just two of the systemic impacts residents face. So as we are having a national conversation about race and equity, where do we begin to examine what racial and economic justice looks like in 21st century Cleveland?
I guess I'll start and I'll hand it over to Erica, and Yumi. First of all, I'm really excited for this group. We have incredible knowledge here. So I'm very grateful to all of the guests that we have here today. And I just want to simply start it by turning it into a positive. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is very exciting. We are in a time where there is an opportunity for great change, and it is necessary, and the community is definitely responsible for this. And at EYEJ, we definitely practice diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're actually building out a case study, thanks to Colin Getz, about how EYEJ leads with this internally, whether it's with our youth through our programming, within our team, within our board. I think it's very, very important. And furthermore, we really believe that diversity in itself is very, very important in order to create great solutions. And this is not just within the nonprofit space. This is whether it's tech or any kind of Fortune 500 company. It is a very exciting thing, and I encourage people to be curious about it. And inclusion is our responsibility. We need to include all. We have to look at our businesses, and if any of our customers, whether directly or indirectly, whether they're word of mouth ambassadors or customers themselves, are Black, we need to not only bring them to the table, we need to go deeper than that and actually have them be part of the decision-making group. And then equity, it is our responsibility. I think equity is actually probably the most important portion of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I actually don't like when we group DEI together, because each component is so important. But equity is probably the most important area because it is our responsibility to bring our own neighbors and community members to an even playing field. And there's many tactics that, the experts, especially Erica Merrick, probably can talk about, and I can express it and how we do it within the EYEJ organization. But I definitely encourage a focus on that as well.
Thank you, Mai.
I'm happy to jump in here and say it has been an interesting few months, right? So I have been in this space, and by this space, doing work around social justice, doing work around racial justice for almost 20 years. And I have seen the ebb and the flow of these conversations at different points. And of course, this is a high energy moment. It is, on the one hand, it is, I am happy to see the energy and some of the conversations that are happening in mainstream spaces, right? So we're hearing language in mainstream spaces that we would not have historically heard. So you're hearing, I've had to check my television a few different times as I'm watching mainstream commercials saying Black Lives Matter. And I actually have seen a lot of sort of very surface, very, everyone has a statement now, right? Everyone wants to make an anti-racism statement. And I think all of these things are great if they lead to some actual sustainable, measurable change. And if the statements that are being made are actually operationalized. I wrote a piece a few weeks ago called Black Lives Matter, Now What? Because I really want to see us move from just lip service and just language to actual practice. So what is going to be different in your organization, in your school, in your government agency, in your company as a result of the declaration, right? And there seems to be an understanding, a growing understanding anyway, about the reality of physical violence on Black bodies, right? Which is part of how this moment happened. Although I would, argue that I think it's a number of things. So part of what led us here, being in the middle of a pandemic, and then having multiple things happen, right? The murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of George Floyd. And I would throw in there also the incident in Central Park with Christian and Amy Cooper as one of the moments that kind of contributed to this moment, this larger moment that we're having. And all of that sort of led to this awareness or this awakening that we're seeing. But in terms of action and like moving beyond the understanding of physical violence, we have to understand the psychological violence that is also happening to Black people in organizations and in other spaces. And so I think it can be tempting for institutions to look outward and say, what can we do about police violence? And they should be answering that question, absolutely. But they need to also turn inward and say, what do we do about our own violence? And what does that look like in terms of our internal practices and policies in our organizations, right? How are we living the idea that Black Lives Matter?
Yes, that's very powerful. Thank you for sharing, Erica Merritt. For the next question, I'm going to open it up to all panelists again. Racism scholar Ibram X. Kendi says one is either racist or anti-racist. There is no room for neutrality, and there is no such thing as a non-racist. What does it mean to be non-racist, and how does that ideology differ from allyship? What role do both theories play in the establishment of equity-centric work in all facets of life?
I'll jump in here. I think I read a quote recently that said, being non-racist facilitates inaction. And so I think that the non-racist identity is really situated in the absence of something rather than being situated in the intentional presence of something or the intentional action. And so, I completely agree with the quote in that there's no such thing as non-racism, just as there's really no such thing as neutrality, especially in issues of injustice. I think the concept of allyship is being complicated right now in what we're seeing in terms of just the current movement. A lot to, I think, Erica's point that she just said is I think there's just a lot of performative allyship, right? So we can make a statement or, there's no real sacrifice in, I can post a statement on my Instagram or I can say Black Lives Matter. It's not as much of a risk. You're not sacrificing. And so I think that what thinkers and speakers like Ibram Kendi are pointing us to is the importance of intentionality and taking action. I think he has another quote. I'm trying to remember exactly. I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit, but he says that racial inequity is not so much a problem of people, but of systems. It's something along those lines. It's not bad people, it's bad policy. And I think what that causes us to think about is what are we intentionally doing to disrupt unjust systems? And I think a lot of times allyship, it's important. I don't want to downplay it, but I think it can take on a very kind of interpersonal focus. So it's like, I have this privilege and I can use it to help this person in this particular acute setting or problem. Whereas anti-racism is more of a lifestyle and like a continuous, perpetual system of taking action against the powers that be and systemic oppression. So yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Do any of the other panelists want to chime in here?
Yeah, going off of that, I just want to add, that obviously in a time like right now, people are really aware, or at least I think so, aware and involved in like the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the murders and everything that has been going on. But like, I feel like people need to realize that this isn't something that's popped out of the blue. This has been happening for hundreds of years, and obviously it stemmed from the brink of slavery, but there's still stuff like that going on right now. And I feel like the more we dive deeper into this like Black Lives Matter movement, and people will realize that it's not just police brutality, it's the prison system, it's inequities in housing and everything, even inequities in connectivity, like the Youth Council is working on. I think it's really important to realize that it's more than that, and it's in every part of a Black person's life. They see the inequities that they're facing. So a way that allies and non-people of color can do more than just post on their Instagram. I think people need to realize their privilege. It comes in every single step of life, and they can realize that they can stand up for Black allies, people of color, and use their privilege in a different way. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
I just want to back that up really quickly. It's funny, I was in a meeting with my church, and there's very, very, very high level Clevelander in our group with this particular committee. And EYEJ came up and he was like, well, that's just a fad. You know, that's going to go away. And I just want to echo that, to be really, really clear that this is not going away. This is very, very serious, and it's very urgent.
You know, Yumi, and actually all of you make excellent points. And it makes me think about a couple of other things. So one in particular, that Ibram Kendi also talks about, this whole idea that we are not, that anti-racist is not something you become, right? That it really is about the behaviors that you're exhibiting at any given moment, and that people are capable, right, of having a racist behavior in one moment and then an anti-racist behavior in another moment. This idea that it is not something that you are just, it's not a permanent state, which makes me think about allyship is also not a permanent state. So one of the things that I have heard often, I often will describe myself as an aspiring ally, because I think it's up to the community that I think that I'm being an ally to determine whether or not that's true at any given moment, and not up to me to put that label on myself. Like, I actually need to check that with somebody and see whether or not they would agree that that's what I'm being. And so it isn't, again, this permanent state. It is something that you know, in one moment may be performing or actually doing something that people would call allyship. But we cannot, you know, so often I hear people, well, I did this, you know, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and that's fantastic that you did that. Like, I'm not minimizing those actions, but we constantly need to be asking ourselves, like, what have we done today? And what are we doing right now that actually pushes us in the direction of racial equity and racial justice? Not, you know, I always think about Janet Jackson and the whole idea of like, what have you done for me lately? When it comes to this whole idea of allyship, that it needs to be something that we are constantly working towards. It is not a permanent state.
And I will back that up as well. I actually don't like the word ally at all. And if you go back to the Bible, it is, again, it's about your neighbor. It is, this work is my life. It is part of my all day, every day. And action is needed. We're in a society right now that awesome people are stepping up to the plate of all backgrounds, all education levels, that are learning about this. Creating book clubs, you know, starting to read more and listening more, which is great, but we are not on this even playing field. And that's an issue. And that's why we're really encouraging people to start stepping up to the plate, start looking at your daily lives, every single decision that you are making, you know, whether you're supporting Facebook or you are supporting going to a fast food chain, or something that you are buying, or something that you are reading even. matters. And I agree that it does go back to the system and the policies. That is the only way that we are going to help our community become a better and more healthy community.
Thank you, Mai. My next question builds upon the answer from the panelist and is looking more at how individuals and community members can make more impactful change. So Erica and Mai, looking at schools, community organizations, and youth-serving entities from an institutional level, what does impactful DEI look like? And how can organizations examine power and privilege in hiring, staff management, curriculum, communications, and practice?
I guess I'll go. That's a big question. So I mentioned before, bringing people to the decision-making table, but also, with EYEJ, we really value a diversity of thought, because I personally truly believe that it cannot be just one entity that is going to solve all of this problem, whether black, white, purple, whatever. I believe that we really need to come together as a community, and that's the only way we're really going to create solutions. What I do applaud is I am seeing a lot of schools and entities and nonprofits that are bringing in experts to work with the teachers. But what I'm not seeing is more of an urgency. There's this method that we want to create a long-term plan. We have to strategize and take the time. But that to me is not fast enough. I think the work needs to come now. And the reason why I say that is that when we allow for those authentic discussions, just like with what our programming, EYEJ, or discussion series, where we bring in all these walks of life with our youth, that authenticity, that vulnerability is what creates healing. It creates new thoughts, and it creates trust. And we have a loss of trust in this country in a major, major way. I see our youth that do not trust adults, and I understand why. I mean, look at what we've done to this society. So my particular recommendation is act now.
Yeah, so I think I am going to say two things that might seem to contradict each other a little bit. So one is I absolutely agree with Mai that we need to act now. And two is I think sometimes we move too quickly and we don't take right action, right? In the spirit of like what I'm seeing right now in a lot of instances is this desire to project manage racism.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think a lot about Audre Lorde's talking about, not being able to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And so I would definitely think of project management as a very sort of dominant culture strategy. And, they're like, come in, give us a plan. We need it by the end of August, and we should have this racism thing sewn up by September at the latest. And that is unrealistic, and it is setting everyone up for failure and disappointment. And so I think that absolutely action, we need to move. We have been waiting hundreds of years. So we absolutely need to move, and we need to move with intention, and we need to move in ways that are very deliberate, and we need to examine what we are doing along the way. So whether we're talking about hiring, or whether we're talking about performance, or whether we're talking about curriculum or communications or any of these other things, we constantly need to be examining what is working and what is not working. And if something is ineffective, then we need to change course. We need a strategy that goes beyond simply training. Training is important, but training is not magic. We need to think about how, again, those organizational policies reinforce what it is that we're trying to create, or whether or not they are actually creating more inequities. And so that's where doing things like disaggregating data right? And being very explicit about who is being impacted by the decisions that we're making in organizations. Every organization should know their numbers, right? They should know, the demographics of if we're talking about schools, they should know the demographics of their student body. They should know the demographics of their faculty and staff. And they should know what their pools look like in terms of their hiring process. And, sort of sitting back and saying, well, we're just not getting candidates you are going to continue to get the same results. You should be tracking who's leaving your organization, right? Not only capturing that data, but really looking for strategies to determine why people are leaving. Or when you're looking at performance, if you have leaders that have a revolving door, right, that cannot keep people, we need to stop saying like, that's just Erica, that's how she is. No, if Erica is doing damage to students, if Erica is doing damage to faculty and staff, Erica needs to not work in that school or that district anymore. And so I believe in, I'm not an off with your head kind of person, right? I think that we need to have room to make mistakes, and we need to have space to course correct, and we need to have coaching and support. But then if all else fails, you cannot continue to keep people in place that are creating a toxic culture or that are not supporting the vision and the mission that you have set forth around creating an equitable school district, school systems, school building.
Can I just, so Erica, I completely agree with you, and I apologize. Let me just clarify my point. And this goes back to self-awareness and emotional intelligence. I think that, well, again, I'm speaking right now of Cleveland. I think we get into this space of overthinking. And so absolutely there has to be some strategy. There has to be some planning. And I encourage organizations that are looking at this to look at people who have been doing this for a long time, whether it's Erica or other people who have expertise in this. But that moment when you start getting into an overthinking moment, I think that's where it gets a little bit toxic.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. There's an excellent article by Paul Gorski that it talks about racial equity detours, right? And one of the strategies that is used is readiness. Oh, we need to wait for everyone to be ready. No, you need to create readiness so that you can move.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. So following up on the last question, I want to look at making impact at a more granular level, specifically at the program level. What are some best practices that organizations can implement to reduce barriers to participation and focus on intersectionality, inclusion, and social justice in all curriculum for youth-serving organizations?
Well, that's a simple question, Haley.
So, I mean, I'll talk about a little bit about curriculum because we actually, EYEJ, have created our own curriculum that's customized for the last 7 years. Again, it goes back to look at who is creating that curriculum. And for us, I mean, we may be a little bit different because we like to have thought leaders and expertise from all kind of backgrounds, but make sure that you have people on that team who, whether they've worked in the environment, whoever, matching your customer, that is a person that can give direction, that can be strategic, that can be a team player in that collaboration of whatever it is. It doesn't have to be curriculum. It can be at the board level.
Yeah, I think when it comes to curriculum, that 95% of in an educational environment, 95% of what we're taking in, and that is probably not an accurate number, but the majority of what we're taking in is driven by dominant culture. And so we really, both in terms of who is creating it and who it centers. So we have to think about when, one, we want windows and mirrors, as a lot of my education friends talk about, right? We want young people to have the opportunity to see themselves, and we want them to have an opportunity to take in the experiences of others. And so it becomes really important how those experiences are shaped. So in other words, it's not just about making sure that people of color, or that Black people are centered in stories. Is it always a story of struggle? Is it always a story of oppression? Exactly. Right? Is it always a hard luck story? Like, we actually experience joy as well, right? We actually experience success as well. And so the way that we are depicted really matters. And the way that we are depicted is so shaped by who's creating the narrative in the first place. And so we have to examine critically the narrative that we are either reinforcing or that we are creating when it comes to curriculum in the context either of a youth serving organization or in an educational institution.
There's actually a good article that actually just came out this morning from the 74 million. Actually, they interviewed one of our students because they were looking at the history classes that are being taught in CMSD. And they had interviewed like 20 of our students about how false those the content in those classes are. And they were asking about our YODJ program because we're teaching topics that are not necessarily in the school setting. And I think I encourage people to read that, because there is a responsibility there that is so awful, that we have been teaching lies. And this is to all students. I mean, Yumi, I don't know if you can weigh in on this, but this is to all students of all demographics, all socioeconomic background, and specifically about the Black culture. And it's really, honestly, disgusting.
Just adding on to that, I mean, obviously from my experience, I do go to a school where we do have a lot of educational benefits that not a lot of schools have, but they often speak about, slavery and other like hardships that Black people have faced in the past and things that do not relate to things going on now. So it is hard to see yourself often, like Erica was talking about, in literature, depicted as someone that's always from a low-income family or someone that isn't successful or whatever it is. It's hard to see someone depicted that you cannot always relate to or doesn't give you a lot of hope, especially as a young kid. It's really disappointing, and like it tells you that's how we're supposed to be. So I think people definitely need to rethink curriculum, rethink literature, not only for the Black students, for everyone, because this is where racism stems from. Obviously, at least I think so, people aren't born racist. People get these views from their parents, from school, and if they're being taught stuff like that, it obviously isn't setting them up for this.
One more thing real quick. Sorry. We actually have, we have all these topics in our curriculum for our discussion series in YODJ, and actually one of them is about racial justice. And I actually stopped that topic because when we were going in with our discussion series, we were going into 6th to 8th graders, teaching this topic. The kids, and our students are mainly African American. These kids know what their environment is. They already know what's up. And I felt like I was actually wrong for bringing in that topic. These kids I felt like I was the problem by talking about, that, there's racism and racial justice. These kids already know they need solutions. Yeah.
I was thinking, how do you frame it around actions, right, that young people can take to move in the direction of racial justice? And I was also, it's interesting. There are always these conversations about students, and particularly, so I used to work in CMSD, and people have all kinds of preconceived sort of stereotypical perceptions of who is a student. in CMSD and what does it mean to be a student in CMSD. And there's also a, how do I describe this? Teachers do not often look at themselves when they think about the disengagement of young people, right? So when young people are disengaged, it has to be all of these reasons that don't, like one of the things I will challenge teachers on sometimes is like, are you boring? And what are you teaching? So I can tell you I was much the same as I am now as a high school student. And I was furious in high school because I was a voracious reader and I was reading things that I was not learning in the classroom. You know, I'm reading Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. I am reading Black Rage in high school. And I am, you know, sitting in this class where you're teaching me. I remember telling my English teacher one day, I was like, do you see any white people in this classroom? I grew up in Warrensville Heights, 99.9% Black. And I was like, could we for once read something that is written by a Black person that might actually be of interest to the people in this classroom? You know, it was so frustrating. I'm like, I don't care about the Romans.
Right.
And I've been learning about them my whole life. Can we please, you know? And so I think we have to look to the other reason why the curriculum is important is because what does it mean to learn in a way that is affirming to your identity? Mm-hmm. So I went to Howard University, and that was a place that was for me. Everything about it was for me. I lived in Tubman Quadrangle, right? I was in a class that I was in a dorm called, specifically James Baldwin Hall, right? I took classes in Douglas Hall, named for Frederick Douglass. And I learned from people that looked like me. And that was deeply, deeply affirming. And it's part of what helps me move through the world in the way that I do today. So those things are not to be underrated.
Most definitely. And wow, this has definitely been a very powerful discussion so far. And we have Maya Jenkins, who is listening in, says, thank you for having this conversation and in a real way, straight talk. So thank you guys so much for sharing your insights, perspectives, and your stories. And I want to remind the audience members, if they have any questions for these amazing panelists, please submit it in the chat box in Zoom or also on the comments on the Facebook Live video event. So my next question is for Erica DeVal. The conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion touches you from several perspectives. You are a philanthropist who, along with your husband, founded the Seth DeVal Foundation. Your husband, football player and hometown hero Seth DeVal, was the first white player to take a knee advocating for the conversation about racial injustice in America. Also, you're a graduate student studying divinity at Fuller Theological Seminary. Can you touch on the various ways that DEI impacts your life, the lives of the people aided by your foundation's work, and ultimately how it will move your work in the divinity space?
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'll talk first about the foundation a little bit, and then I'll talk about why I'm in seminary and my seminary experience. So the foundation, what it was born out of. So yeah, my husband's an athlete. His dream was never actually to be a professional athlete. He just wanted to play in college. But that process he found of making the transition from high school athletics to college athletics was extremely difficult. It's just, it's really expensive. First of all, you are relying on a ton of just resources and connections, and you have to have a certain network. And it's a complex process to go to college, to be a college athlete. And so in reflecting on that, we just kind of talked about, it was that difficult. And he sits at the intersection of so many privileged identities, right? Like he's white, he's a man, he comes from a financially stable family and home, and it was just unbelievably difficult for him. And so we just began to talk about the ways in which we might be able to help to make that process more accessible and just easier to navigate for people who, you know, don't sit at the intersection of all of those privileged identities. I think athlete or not, making whatever the next step is after high school, it's extremely difficult. There are obstacles that are determined by various oppressive systems, right? Like we're talking, you know, economic inequality, obviously racial inequality, and other social inequalities. I think higher education in general, just college, is built for the hyper privileged. And so what we want to do through the foundation is commit to equity work in terms of kind of like Maya was saying earlier, like evening the playing field, just kind of bridging the gap that exists, because, you know, it's not a matter of, honestly, like hard work. There are so many incredibly hardworking students and student athletes. It's way more about these kind of just systemic obstacles that, if you really examine them, are intentionally put in place, right? It's no mystery or accident. And so yeah, that's what we are really trying to do through the foundation. Seminary. So the reason why I'm in seminary, first of all, the church has a lot of problems. I'm sure that's not a mystery to anybody. There are a lot of issues in the Western kind of mainstream American church. And I think that I really want to be a part of dismantling the legacy of white supremacy that still has a hold on the church today. And I think, you know, there's a few aspects to that. One is just talk about miseducation. The ideas that a lot of American Christians have about church and church history are completely false. I don't think we talk enough about how the church, I guess the idea we have of the church is that in history it was maybe this kind of innocent bystander to all of the racism that was going on, when in fact it was intentionally perpetuating and building systems of racial hierarchy for its own benefit. And so that's not the kind of legacy that just goes away. And so what my hope is in, you know, pursuing a vocation in ministry is to really commit to this sort of equity work within the church. I think Maya also said something earlier about how she felt like equity out of, you know, DEI, that equity piece being particularly important. And I think that shows up a lot in the work that I do in church spaces, because I think it's easy for, you know, a predominantly white church to be like, our doors are open, you know, anybody can come. You're welcome. Diversity, inclusion, like, come on in. But if you're just opening your doors so that Black and brown people are walking into an oppressive, toxic space, I mean, you're not serving anybody, again, except for yourself. And you have this expectation that the Black and brown people that come in are just going to assimilate to your way of doing things, your theology, your ideology. And so really what I want to focus on before diversity and inclusion within church spaces is that equity piece. And I think that what that starts with is actually diversifying the voices that we're listening to when we do theological work. In seminary, I read a lot of old white straight men, and that's about it, you know? And so I think, and anybody else is considered like a contextual perspective, a contextual voice. And so, yeah, I think really if we're going to talk about diversifying, before we even begin to diversify church spaces, we have to diversify what we're reading, who we're listening to, the voices that we're allowing to influence our theology. And then maybe we can create spaces that are actually safe for Black and brown people to enter into openly and vulnerably. So yeah, that's, long story short, that's why I'm in seminary. I basically just want to tear down oppressive systems and, you know, build up something more equitable.
Yeah. Well, I know you're going to definitely make a big difference there. So thank you for all of your work in that space. And I have one more question for Yumi before we go to questions from our audience members. So Yumi, what do you envision the role of youth is in the ongoing conversation in this country related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? What is the starting point for young people in Cleveland?
Yeah, so it's a big topic. I feel like a lot of the time people say, oh, the youth are our future, blah, blah, blah. But I feel like a lot of the pressure and weight is put on kids and youth to handle the huge, crazy situations that are going on outside. And oftentimes, youth are the only people that are actually making change. So I do see the importance of youth voices, youth perspectives in conversations about policy, about, changing the world around us. But I also feel like the adults around them need to be allies, or maybe not allies, need to support and provide whatever that is, financial support, spreading their message. They need to help with that, because youth should not be given the responsibility of changing the issues that we have to deal with in our world. But at this point, they kind of are the only voice that seems to not be completely corrupt. So obviously youth voices are extremely important. And yeah, we need to give them a platform to do that. And with the Youth Council, we've been working on getting broadband internet for all youth in Cleveland. And that is just another step of how we are giving support to the youth. I mean, how are they supposed to do online school if they don't have internet, don't have any way to connect? And that is just another example of the inequities in Cleveland and between different public schools, between public and private schools. And yeah, so youth need a platform, need support in getting that platform, because youth voices do matter. We have a lot to say, but when no one is listening, it's a little bit frustrating and no change is made to happen. So
Thank you, Yumi.
I'll quickly back that up. EYEJ, we've been around 7 years, and probably 2 years into this work, I realized, and while our focus will always be the youth, that's our mission, but I realized this has really nothing to do with the youth. This work is about the community, and we had 450 volunteers at that time, and hence why Kenyatta produced this, EYEJ Speaks for the community, because it is very frustrating, and I feel a lot of times guilty that I'm constantly, our youth council, right? That a lot of times we put all, like Yumi saying, put all this pressure, answer everything, you come up with the solutions, but wait, I'm not going to listen to you. So again, this is a community task that we must face and we must take action on.
Thank you, Mai. We're going to move into questions from the audience members. The first question is from Danielle Ann. I'm one of the few people of color members of a predominantly white upper middle class group of women. I've witnessed them trying to have a candid discussions of race, privilege, white fragility, language, and how to learn and speak out more. One thing I'm learning from being privy to these really well-intentioned discussions is that there is a lot of fear in getting it wrong and publicly being called out on it. I understand always showing up as an ally is a continuous journey of living it, embodying it, but there's a real fear of being called out on why don't they already know all this? Why are they only just trying to learn now? And they are shrinking back in. These are a group of powerful women who are often in the spotlight and who can serve as influential powers behind the throne. How do we get them to act with urgency and a sense of ownership instead of turning it off because they can?
All right, I'm trying to distill my multiple thoughts at one time. So one of the things that I'll say is, it always strikes me that if you look at Tema Okun's work around white supremacy culture, one of the tenets of that is perfectionism. And I think we see that play out a lot in this conversation, right? I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. But I also hold that does not come from nowhere, right? We do live in a call out culture. And unfortunately, those call outs aren't always about accountability. Sometimes they really are just cruel, and they are meant to shame people instead of supporting their learning. So I think for those of us who could be in the position of holding people accountable to be able to make the distinction between supporting someone's learning, right, and holding them accountable, and shaming people. Like, we need to, shame and guilt do not lead to action. They just don't. And so while I too believe that we need to own our mistakes, if you will, making someone feel terrible is actually not probably going to get you where you need to go. So we need to know that. But the flip side of that is we have to decide how committed we are. Every time we speak out, even in this moment now, any one of us could say something that doesn't land well with someone else, or that gets taken out of context. And at some point, we have to just have some courage and say that we are going to do it afraid, and we are going to do it uncomfortable. But the cost of not speaking up is far worse than the chance of saying the wrong thing. Like, what do we care more about? Do we care more about getting our feelings hurt, or do we care more about ending racial injustice?
Add really quick. Oh, sorry. Really quickly. Especially throughout social media, at least I know there's a big emphasis on cancel culture, which is extremely toxic. Obviously, going basically what Erica said, but there is a difference between speaking out or saying blatantly racist things and committing microaggressions, and not that neither of those things are not racist. It's just that you have to see what the person's intentions of saying or doing those things were. And I feel like we need to focus more on growth, and instead of, like, obviously cancel culture, canceling someone for saying a certain thing or doing a certain thing. So education is extremely important. And also we need to teach people how to make change on that, how they can be allies, what they can do with their privilege. There isn't an easy answer to this, but I think that education and change is really important.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of going back to our discussion about non-racism versus anti-racism, I think a key component of being anti-racist is that people who were privileged have to be okay with discomfort. And so I think that sometimes you're going to say the wrong thing, and you probably will get called out, and hopefully it's graciously and not from a place of shame. But I just think that the mindset going into this anti-racism work should acknowledge that it's messy and it's difficult. And if I, again, sitting at my place of privilege, am uncomfortable, imagine what the people who have been enduring the brunt of racism have been feeling for centuries. And so, just kind of being able to lean into that discomfort a little bit, I think is super, super important for this type of work to be sustainable. So I just wanted to echo what everybody said. I think that there needs to be a good balance of grace and accountability, and a willingness to, be wrong graciously as well too sometimes.
I just want to say one last thing, Danielle. For you, I think, first of all, you must be very tired, because I know, including myself, but many other people in that position that are very, very exhausted. And I think self-care, I would recommend self-care for you, but also I think, step into your power. You are clearly a lead in that situation, and I hope that you know that. And I hope that that there is security there and confidence there to really know that and hold your power in that role.
Thank you, Mai. Before we leave today's discussion, I would love to hear a 1-minute summary on one key point that our panelists have for viewers that they hope to take away from this conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So why don't we start with Mai?
Okay, in regards to equity, the one key point I would say is be careful and cautious with your judgment. we really cannot judge people in this day and age. We really don't know a person's, we may not even know a person's true ethnicity. We don't know a person's background. We don't know a person's education level, experience. And I think that has a lot to do with equity work, whether it is looking at resumes, with whether it is looking at someone's comment on Facebook, whatever the case may be. I say just proceed with caution when you are out there judging people.
Thank you, Mai. Erica Merritt?
Yeah, so I think we have to get to a point where this feels like everyone's work, where this feels like an American problem and not just a Black people problem or a people of color problem, but an everyone problem. And so, you know, people will say different things about who needs to solve racism. I actually do not subscribe to the idea that white people alone are going to solve racism. I actually find that to be a very bad idea for a lot of reasons. I mean, look where we are, right? I think it's going to require all of us. And we have to think about racism not just as an interpersonal thing, right? And not just as individual meanness, but we really need to understand that it exists at a structural level, that it exists at an institutional level, and that we really have to look broadly at policy, at practice, and of course at our own individual behaviors and those of the people around us. But I guess I also just want people to understand that we are all going to make mistakes. If there were a perfect way to do this, we would not be sitting here having this conversation, because it would have been done already. And yet here we are, right? So wherever you are starting, right? Start from where you are, but don't stay there. So wherever you are in this moment, you need to keep moving in the direction of learning, and you need to be moving in the direction of action wherever you are, whether that's in an organization, whether that's in your community, whether that's in your school if you are a young person. But we all have work to do.
Thank you, Erica. Erica DeVal?
Yeah, I would say a big takeaway that I would encourage is just to, you know, as this movement continues and as we're talking about really disrupting systems that have become commonplace and comfortable, I think that it'll be really important to just be constantly questioning your own assumptions, you know, assumptions of what order is, right? Things are going to maybe seem chaotic in coming months or years, but how are we defining chaos in a world where, you know, order is based on white supremacy, or, you know, questioning, you know, how your own actions might be contributing or just complicit in certain systems, I think. And that kind of pulls into the intentionality piece that I think we got to talk about in discussing Ibram Kendi. I think that is so important, just in intentional steps, intentional actions, thinking critically about, you know, the ways in which we move in the world and navigate these spaces is super important.
Thank you, Erica. And last but not least, Yumi.
What I have to say is just continue educating yourself, continue having these discussions, and see ways that you can make change, see how you can support people of color, Black people, and continue being an ally. Also question things around you, question why certain things work this way. I mean, realize small things that maybe you have privilege on that you've never noticed before. And also just continue making change. You should never stop. You should continue seeing how much more can I go? What more can I do for these people? Because obviously the issue is not solved yet. So, yeah.
Thank you, Yumi. That's all the time we have for today, and I would like to thank our wonderful panelists, Mai Moore, Erica Merritt, Erica DeVal, and Yumi Nglovu. As an EYEJ volunteer, it's been a pleasure to host this week's episode. If you want to hear more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, be sure to follow the conversation on EYEJ's social media platforms. Additionally, please check out our blog recap and behind the scenes podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all other major podcast platforms. Thank you to the EYEJ team for their phenomenal work on this program. Tara, Mega, Juan, Anna, Andre, Pia, and Kenyatta. I hope to see you tomorrow for EYEJ's Day of Giving festivities. The fun will begin at 9 a.m. sharp, so be sure to visit our social media for more information. Learn more about the impact of our work and how you can join the EYEJ movement. We will see you next week at 10 a.m. for our next EYEJ Speaks discussion. Thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you.